I had a job working for Turner Dairy Milk Company, and I was there for like 12, 14 years. And I remember being at a conference, and a lady laid her hands on me and prayed over me. And she said, God's got a great and mighty work for you to do. Time to step out of the boat. And during that season, I was preaching a sermon called Get Out of the Boat. And I was at Oak Grove, and I was reading the scripture on the pew of the church in Mark, where Peter told Jesus, we left everything. And Jesus said, who's not left brother, sister, mother, father, fields, the kingdom of God receive one time more. And when it said fields, God just kind of spoke to me, you can preach it, but can you live it? And so that year, I left my job with not another job to go to, not another ministry job to go to. I left my job with no insurance. I still have no insurance now, with no retirement. I mean, I have retirement, but I spent all my 401k. And for the first 4 or 5 months, I did what I loved doing. And then the bottom fell out, and I didn't know how I was going to make it. I moved with an elderly man, and he let me stay with him for like 9 months. Didn't charge me anything, but I remember those 9 months questioning God, not knowing what he's called me to do. I didn't have a job, didn't have any income coming in. I don't know how I made it. I remember just nights just crying out to God. And so that was probably my biggest doubt. I was probably closer to God during that season. I remember him waking me up at 4 o'clock in the morning and just speaking to me on different passages. But there's definitely much doubt. I feel like God abandoned me and really doubt his promise. So that was probably the biggest season for about 9 months of just wondering where God was and him on his word. I remember being a Hebrew community church. Hebrew is not even a church anymore, but I remember struggling whether God's coming to preach or not, just because I didn't want to say I'm called and then, a month later nobody would know where it's at. And so I remember during revival, there's preachers preaching, and I remember the last night going on the altar saying, God, have you called me to preach? And I went back and set my seat, and I remember walking down the aisle of about a 40, 50 member small community church and thinking, God, of all the people you could have chose, you chose me. And I'm not a crier. And I remember almost being in tears, just in that moment, like 40, 50 people, just like me and God in that room, and just the overwhelming sense that God had called me. And so I think that was just a powerful moment in my life where I just, there's been other moments where you just feel the closeness of God and great encounters, but just the call to preach was like, God, of all the people in the world, you chose me. A lot of people I could think, so many people God has put in my path to help me. The elderly man that I lived with 9 months, he didn't charge me any rent to stay there. My mom has been a great blessing. People God's brought my path, but I think the most influential person was after I came out of that 9 months of not having a job and, just crying out to God, what you can do next. I ran into a pastor that I'd done prison ministry at his church a lot, and it was at Faith Baptist. I ran into this pastor, and I was just in a season where I was desperate. And I remember some friends of mine had taught me about going to seminary, and I had no desire to go to seminary. I was like, I don't, really care about going to seminary. During that time, God had changed my heart to go to seminary. And I remember walking in the office of Dr. Danny Singfield at Faith Baptist, and he barely even knew my name. And he'd seen me around before, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about going to seminary. And the next words out of his mouth is, we're going to take care of that. And I'm like, you don't even know me. And so they paid my scholarship to go to school. The church actually paid my apartment for a whole year. So he was probably one of the most influential people. I would not be doing what I'm doing now at Briarcrest and ECS and some of the big Christian schools and traveling if it was not for him. Like I said, there's so many people that you can run across paths with that have just reached out to you. But I think God used him to really, he honored his word, but at the same time he used Brother Danny to actually be influential in my life. I think when God began to, at 28, when he began to bring me out of my mess, drinking and partying and the pain I've been through, just all this stuff, I think during that season was a great turning point where just, he set me free from pornography and drinking and just that things of cleansing. It was just powerful. I remember, getting up from a gambling table, just under conviction, walking away. I remember, just the conviction of seizing my life. So I remember that was a great turning point. And like I shared, tonight, when just a brokenness when I went out to the gravesite and prayed, and just the brokenness, the tears and weeping. And I feel like when I got up, that was kind of just a turning point where God began to start transforming me. So I think right after I became a Christian, this is the transformation of cleansing in my life, where God set me free. It was not it was a process, but just the power of that. So I would say I'm a Christian, one, because Jesus saved me, and he changed my life, but also because Jesus is real. There's a lot of questions I have about him. There's a lot of things I would never understand, but it's one thing I know, he's real. And I heard a preacher say something one time: if there's no hell, I still love Jesus. And I've come into a relationship with him now. That if you came into me today, which I believe there's a hell, but if you came into me today and said, "Down, there's no hell," I still love Jesus because who he is. He changed my life. And so to me, why I'm a Christian is because he saved me, changed me, but because he's real and he loves me. And so that's why I'm a Christian. Years ago, when I first came into ministry, I was back at my mom's house watching TV, and I watched about a revival called the Welch Revival, and how the mules back in the day quit cussing because people, they quit, the mules didn't know how to operate because people quit cussing. And just saw this, and it just kind of intrigued me. And so then I started studying revivals and the great awakenings of our nation and the movements of God. And just it was just awesome to me to see how God changed a culture and changed the nation. Where, at Welch, the people leaving football practice come to church, and they just. I also studied where, they had a service that supposed to start at 2 o'clock and 11 o'clock, the church was filled. But also the impact it had upon students, how students were coming to church. And almost every great revival I've seen had influence upon students, anywhere from the Hebrides Revival to the Great Awakenings. And so my passion and my purpose, I think, in ministry is to see another Great Awakening. That's the only hope for our nation, and to pour in the lives of students. There's a hurting generation out there, there's a desperate generation out there, and I think if God's going to move, it's going to be this generation. So my purpose and passion in ministry is to see our nation being transformed as a Great Awakening, and I believe it can happen through the students. Just the fact that knowing that God I'm loved by Him, through all the pain and hurt of life, that realized that I had an incident happen years ago, and I was at preaching, and a man just laid his hand on me and said, God's very loved by you, and you're very loved by God. And just to understand that, that God is real, and the fact He can change your life. He changed my life, and He brought me out of brain and brokenness, and to share that God can change anybody's life. And so where there's no hope, He can give hope.